Meeting 12 of the Poem Community Task Force. Really wonderful to be with you. Happy February. We will kick off. Before I begin, and I'm supposed to give a cue to my friend Mariana to start recording, and also note to everyone that we do record our meetings because we are operating in a virtual environment. So please note that the recording of this will be published on our website after the meeting. And since we're all in Zoom land, we'll do an orientation for those who are new joining us tonight. What we ask our task force members to do and all folks joining us is to please mute yourself when you're not speaking, hold questions and comments for designated discussion times, and we'll try to be clear about when those are, just so that we can manage the queue and make sure everyone gets a chance to speak. And please use the raise your hand function to do that. That should be within your participants tab, I believe, participants or maybe chat tab. Feel free to chat us if you're having any technical difficulties or struggling to find that raise your hand button. For our audience members joining us, we're so happy to have you. Thank you for being here and spending your Monday evening with us. We do ask that you mute yourself and turn your video off except during public comment opportunities, just so our task force members can kind of get the sense of their fellow members around the table. And we love the chat, and we do encourage you to use it, but we would ask that you try to keep it open, mostly for technical troubleshooting, so we can make sure that everyone is able to access the meeting and participate. All right, I will quickly review our agenda for this evening. We're really excited for this discussion because it represents the last of our sort of introduction to different pricing typologies meetings. This is our fifth typology, which is commercial services. So after we do some welcome and housekeeping items, we will give a brief overview presentation to cover some of the highlights that were in the pre-meeting materials for tonight's discussion on commercial services pricing. And we'll talk about how we're defining that, but really it's looking at private for hire trips and urban delivery trips. We'll have some time for some Q&A at that point with our presenters before we break into small groups and go through several discussion exercises to really tease out some of the nuance of this exciting and interesting topic. We'll come back together, do a bit of a report out, and then spend some time looking forward and thinking about next steps together. But before we dive into all the fun stuff, I just want to ask if there were any questions, comments, or concerns with our meeting number 11 summary. Not seeing any hands jump up or anyone come off mute. We'll call that final. That's available online along with the recording from the January conversation. And now we'll move into public comment. I want to point out to the task force members that we did get 2 written comments set in prior to this meeting. Those have both been emailed to you and are also available on the website under tonight's meeting calendar event. But do we have any members of the public with us this evening that would like to provide verbal comment? If you would, I would ask that you raise your hand and we'll give you a couple minutes to address the task force. All right, I'm not seeing any hands. Mariana and Michael, are you seeing any hands that I'm missing?
No hands.
Okay, great. So we will continue into the meat of the meeting. And before we dive into that, I'm going to turn it over to Shoshana to provide a really brief update on tolling. Over to you.
Thanks. Good evening, everyone. Nice to be with you virtually again this month. Thanks for joining us. So as Emma just said, we're going to spend most of our meeting on commercial services tonight, but just wanted to give a really brief update since we've talked about tolling a few times. ODOT continues to move forward with their tolling program. And in particular, there is some state legislation, HB 3055, I believe, where they've been making some changes, or they proposed some changes at the state level to the tolling legislation or to tolling state statute. And we're concerned about the changes that they are proposing. ODOT for a while has been talking about sort of their dual purposes of tolling, both raising revenue and congestion management. And the proposed legislation really moves away from congestion management and seems to focus much more on tolling for raising revenue, and really also restricts the restricts the revenue to what is described as tollway projects. So there's actually a hearing tomorrow morning in the Joint Transportation Committee, and we are actually sending a joint letter with some other agency partners and to express that this is not the direction that we'd like to see the toll program go. We have shared the discussions and the feedback that you all gave to us around tolling with our leadership, and sort of feel like this is in line with the feedback that we've gotten from you to try to keep ODOT at this point, at least to not further restrict the toll program, so we can all continue talking about how to do it in a way that is aligned with city values and climate and equity and safety. So that's just wanted to have you all be aware that that's going on. And that's really the update right now. I don't know if there's any questions about that before we move into commercial services.
I just wanted to thank you for that update, Shoshana, and just to ask that you keep us posted as things develop there. If there's any, I know at the beginning of this task force, there was a lot of talk about a desire to take action rather than just to take in information. And so if this is something that we can act on, I think that would be welcome.
Great, thank you. Yeah, well, and I guess as a starter, once the letter is submitted, we'll send that letter out so you all can see sort of how the city is weighing in, and try to think about sort of other ways that there can be particular action around that. Thank you.
Thanks, Adie. I saw Sharifa's hand up. Sharifa, go for it.
Yeah, it kind of brought to mind sort of, and I've been thinking about this all month and thinking about mentioning it anyway. It seemed to me that most everybody on the task force approves of the notion of using, if there was any kind of pricing, using the funds for expanded transit or something other than road oriented things. And I feel like I recall from the beginning of the, when you guys explained everything on the first day, that we can make recommendations at any point during this 18 months to, if we have any recommendations. And I think that it might be worth a vote or whatever to make a recommendation as a task force to the city to try and figure out a way to dislodge this constitutional restriction on how to spend these funds. And if we could somehow put that to a vote in order to make that recommendation. I don't know exactly how that happens formally, but it was just something I've been thinking of. Obviously we have a broad spectrum of opinions on all sorts of things. And I mean, I know that there's a contingency of people who believe that we should just have tolling even if we can't get the funds directed the way we want to. It's still very important, but I feel like even those people could probably back some kind of a recommendation that I'm talking about to somehow dislodge this constitutional restriction. So that's all.
Thanks, Sharifa. Really appreciate that. And you're right that is in the charter. I see some clap emojis from Adie and others, but you're absolutely right that that's in the charter, that the group can make recommendations. I think that this is also one reason why we intentionally kind of spent a little bit more time on tolling, because we knew this was going to happen, that this would be a fast moving project, and we wanted to position the city to be able to engage with that, having heard the deliberation of this group. And you're also right that we haven't voted yet on formal recommendations about anything. What we did do is we crystallized some of those themes that we heard emerging in November, and we kind of took a vote on level of comfort, not calling those recommendations, but on sort of sharing that with leadership, which, as Shoshana said, that is what we did and what has been informing the moves to date. If there is interest in formalizing that more and taking this further, and I'm going to kind of do this on the fly, so Shoshana, as my co-PM, please chime in here, but I think what I might propose is that we note that down from this meeting and we hear from the other folks who have raised their hand, and then be prepared to take a vote on that at the next meeting. I'd want to give everyone a chance to kind of think about that. We would document it in the summary, kind of document what the question is, and then come prepared to discuss and vote next time. But maybe I'll see what Shoshana thinks about that proposal, and then we can hear from Hao and Jonathan as well.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. It would be good to sort of figure out exactly what we're voting on and be able to give you all a little bit of chance and come back. I guess I think there would be either crystallizing the feedback that you've gotten in or that we've gotten so far, but I also hear Sharifa you talking about very specifically around the constitutional restriction question, and we absolutely want and invite feedback on that. It's also you know, a huge, it's not something the city alone will be able to tackle. So a huge issue, but want your feedback on that. Absolutely. And it can hopefully continue to inform how the city engages both in this current tolling conversation, and that really is a broader conversation related to a number of these things. So that makes sense. But yeah, it might be good to give us a little bit of time and come back, give everyone a little bit of time and come back and be prepared to talk about it a little bit more next time.
Even if we could have an idea of the template of what that kind of recommendation looks like, would be nice. You know, I mean, like, send us all in an email like what that looks like.
I think that's a great thought. I think that's kind of exactly what we'd want to do. I'll be frankly really honest with you. We're really excited to get to this point. This is our first time doing this too. So I think that there's going to be a little bit of a learning curve. I think as we previewed at our last meeting, and we'll talk about again at the end of this one, what we're driving towards at a final report is a suite of recommendations that fall into a few buckets, some like overarching principles, some recommended nearer term moves, some recommended longer term moves. But I think that this kind of interim idea of this is something the task force or a majority of the task force feels is a important recommendation they want to lead up to leadership. We just need to work on exactly how that could look and propose something, and then have a discussion and vote on it at our next meeting. Hao, do you want to jump in here?
Sure. I'm just curious. So we're not the only group that is talking about the equity implications of tolling. There's also, I'm not sure if I have the acronym right, but there is also an advisory committee that ODOT is consulting specifically on their toll project. And then there's also the Metro. And my question is more of how do we coordinate with those groups? Because I do think there is strength in numbers, and to have sort of a coordinated message to push back on these legislative mandates if they aren't, if they're standing in the way of equitable mobility. So anyway, it's just a question that I wanted to throw out there because we're not the only ones talking about this.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Hao. Really great point. And I think the committee you're thinking of is the Equity and Mobility Advisory Committee that ODOT has set up. Michael Espinoza from our project team sits on that committee. So he shows up there also kind of informed by this process. But I think task force members brought this up, I think at our November meeting as well, this kind of interest in coordinating with the EMAC. We're still exploring, with our partners exactly how that could look, but we'll take that on board and work on that even faster. I also want to just remind folks that, the charge of this group is to advise the city, and it's an interesting space because we're also carefully watching a regional conversation and weighing in on that. But completely take your point, and I think there will always be a little bit of a unique nuance of this group advising city leadership. But you're right about the unified voice and the power that can have. Jonathan?
Hello. My question for Shoshana is, do you have a sense of why ODOT is backsliding a little? And what I'm really asking is there a political or optical relationship between this, sort of backsliding, if you will, around potential toll revenues and responding to some potential backlash around freeway widening around the Rose Quarter, et cetera, and kind of, sort of giving that to the community, if you will, in exchange for, if it's the truckers, more rural interests, Eastern Oregon legislators. Is there a connection politically?
Well, what I can share is that I think, I mean, ODOT has been very clear. The legislature has been pretty clear all along. You know, again, they've had two purposes. One is very much to be funding the projects. I think originally the projects, I-205 in particular, I'm feeling too fuzzy right now, but when the toll language, or what they were calling at the time value pricing, was sort of first put into state legislation, and is part of the big transportation bill in HB 2017, there was discussion around I-205, the Rose Quarter, actually at the time 217, although I don't think that was ever meant to be funded with toll revenue. But the revenue, before they were calling it a congestion relief fund, and a significant part of that was always to raise money for the big projects. ODOT has been pretty clear. We've been pretty clear. The city feedback sort of consistently has said it should really be more about using the existing system that you have and managing that well, and that will do just as much to relieve congestion as building the big things. We would argue more, but ODOT has also been pretty clear that it's about building things. And I think that for financial reasons, they want to use the money to build things. So I don't know that I can speak to all of the politics, but I think that there's, that is a clear, it's clearly something they want to do with the money. And I think we, at least at this point, we want to make sure it's not the only thing that they could do with the money. And, I think we've also discussed there is constitutional restrictions, which would prevent money from being used for things like transit service. Even within constitutional restrictions, there are, really significant investments, like for instance, on 82nd, which if the toll program were to extend all along I-205, which they're talking now, there would be huge impacts on 82nd. And we think there's a lot of good that money could do being invested in 82nd as well. So there are many different sort of ways to push. And we continue to invite this committee's feedback on where the city should push. And again, knowing that then it's pushing us on a process that we're not in control of. But yeah, I don't know. So I think paying for the projects is probably driving this at the moment, but.
The only thing I would add to that is just, I think way back when at the very start of this project, I think it might have been Sarah mentioned, we had some early framing around congestion management. And I think that there were good comments about you can manage congestion in a lot of ways. And we've kind of now tried to really talk about reducing VMT or reducing trips, because I think you can manage congestion also by adding capacity. So I do think that that's an element here as well, that these terms really matter, and they also can mean a lot of different things.
Got it. Thank you.
All right, folks. Well, that was a really good discussion. I really appreciate it. We'll take that feedback on. We'll do some thinking on capturing the points that Sharifa raised, sending those back out so we have some time to think about them before the next meeting, and then try our hands at a first vote on a recommendation from this group. But with your permission, I'm going to move us then into the key topic for tonight, which is pricing commercial services. And I will turn it back over to Shoshana to kick us off.
All right. And I think we're on the next slide already, right? Okay. So again, the meat of the most of our time tonight will be talking about commercial services. And when we say that, it's sort of a vague term, commercial services, but we're really talking about three types of commercial services that use our roadways to transport people and goods. And there are private for hire services. I think in some places they maybe refer to these as vehicles for hire, examples like Uber and Lyft, as well as taxis. And this is, where you request a vehicle and you request the driver to take you from here to there, point A to point B. Then there are on-demand urban delivery services, which will allow you to request a thing, food, a good, something, to be delivered to you, quickly on demand. To order from a restaurant and you want it sent to you right away. And then finally, there's sort of more traditional urban delivery services such as FedEx and UPS that deliver goods to you, but not as immediately. So those are the 3 types of things that we're talking about this evening. And as we start this conversation, we want to acknowledge that these services exist because they are meeting many needs, and especially during the last year, during COVID, they really have been meeting a lot of needs. They've helped people meet needs while continuing or without putting their health at risk. So it's important to acknowledge all the ways that they're helping people. They're helping people increase access to goods. Again, especially important during COVID, increasing accessibility to people to get where they need to go. This is especially important in places where there are gaps in other systems. If there's not good transit, you can take an Uber or a Lyft. And they're giving people more options of just ways to get around. There's been some consideration that, especially for people who are car free or who are considering going car free, you could, if you know that occasionally you could call an Uber or Lyft, you might be more likely to get rid of a car and continue to have some options. I'm not sure on the data if we're seeing that actually happening, but they definitely give people options. They also alleviate parking pressure. And something that's interesting is there may be more opportunities for electrifying with these types of services. It may be easier to concentrate on electrifying a fleet, and that may happen more easily than the time it's going to take for all of us to switch to electric vehicles. And another important and I see a note from Shani saying that it's true that they offer services, but not during COVID. And yes, and we will talk, we'll talk a lot. We're going to show some data and sort of talk about some trends, all of which were pre-COVID, and then we'll talk about how things have changed during COVID, and they've definitely changed dramatically. But the last other thing that is, the way that these are sort of providing some benefits is they're creating a lot of work opportunities. And I think there is a pretty healthy debate from what I hear about sort of pros and cons of those work opportunities with many people saying they're easy to access and they're offering flexible jobs that meet people's needs. And on the flip side, some people saying, they're low paying, they don't have good benefits, and there are challenges there too. But regardless, they are definitely offering some work opportunities in a way that is a little bit unique from most of the other things that we've talked about. So why, with all of those benefits, why are we talking about, why would we even be asking you what you think about considering pricing these more? So they're also, in addition to all of those things, they're having a pretty significant impact on our transportation system. We see that they're growing, again, this is pre-COVID, but they have been a growing share of trips, of vehicle miles traveled, and emissions on our roads. In 2019, Portlanders took more than 12 million private for hire trips, which was almost a 400% increase over 2015. And in delivery emissions, we don't have good data in Portland, so we're going to share more data from other places for urban delivery, but in delivery emissions were expected to rise by 32% by 2030 in the biggest cities, and congestion from delivery to increase by 21%. So definitely growing. And something else that's a little bit unique is a significant portion of the vehicle miles traveled associated with these trips is spent sort of in between the main trip. If I'm going to go shopping, I'm going to get in my car, leave my house, and go to the shopping store, and that's the whole trip. Whereas if I'm ordering something from a restaurant, that car may drive to the restaurant first as the initial trip, or an increase in B&T, and then drive to my house. And TNCs also spend some time driving around, either looking for or waiting for passengers or driving to their passengers. So there's that extra component of BMT in these trips. They're also increasing demand for curb space for pickup and drop off. We're seeing trips occur in places where there are a fair amount of other alternatives. And essentially, like the other discussions that we've had, price signals may help to manage the demand for these trips and account for impact. So that's sort of the why might we even consider it. So these maps, I think we shared them with you in the memo for those who had a chance to look at this. These are maps that are also pre-COVID, and they are showing trips in peak hour. And the map on the left is showing the, make sure I'm saying this right. On the left shows the origins of rides that are ending in the central city, and on the right shows the destination of rides that are starting in the central city. I see we have a request to make it bigger. I'm not sure. There we go.
I'm trying.
It gets fuzzier. I think these are pretty hard to read, and I'm not sure if making it bigger is helping. Describing what it's showing is that the yellow areas are the areas where there's a lot of trips. So what we're seeing is that in peak hours and rush hours, there are a significant number of pretty short trips, either starting or ending pretty close to the central city, short trips in peak hours. And these are in places where we know there are a lot of other alternatives. So it's sort of showing again just that there are short trips where we think that people probably have other alternatives. It doesn't, that's just what it's showing. And again, all pre-COVID, but we wanted to share that with you. And I think that's really it for this slide. Then, as I mentioned, we don't have data or good data or much data on e-commerce in Portland, but there have been some studies and there's some analysis, and so we're sharing a little bit. This is a chart that shows some of the impacts of e-commerce on traffic volume in the top 100 global cities. Again, Portland is actually not a part of this, but we think that the trends are likely to be similar, if not the exact data. And one thing that they looked at was how much additional VMT on roads come specifically from delivery traffic. And you might think that delivery traffic is sort of offsetting personal trips. Because if I'm not driving to the store to buy something and instead I'm just ordering it, maybe that's a 1-for-1 exchange. But what the analysis showed was that for every 100 miles of delivery traffic, only about 30 miles were replacing individual shopping vehicle miles traveled. So it's not, there's still more delivery traffic that's being added. It's not that 1-for-1 exchange. And this is essentially speculating at this point, but a couple of reasons. If you go to the store and you're there and then maybe you buy many things versus on demand, you buy one thing from 5 different shops because it's easy, and then you induce 5 different trips. And I think also potentially sort of this on-demand nature means a little bit less organized and sort of delivery logistics. And so again, maybe incenting more trips is what we're seeing rather than what would happen if people are taking their own trips and shopping. So it's not a 1-to-1 replacement, at least in the early analysis. And so this is all from a report by the World Economic Forum that came out in 2020, but I think was using data from pre-2020. And what they're showing is that if things don't change from the pre-COVID situation, that we would be on track for delivery vehicles for rising by about 36%, emissions rising about 6 million tons or 32%, and congestion as measured by average commute times here, rising by about 21%. So again, it's essentially showing trends of pretty significant increasing by e-commerce. And I think it's hard to say, for COVID, we've seen this actually, I think, increase even more quickly, but it's also hard to say exactly what's going to happen when the pandemic ends. I feel like I should not have come something. So speaking of COVID, there have been significant impacts during the pandemic. And we've seen both reduced demand, very significant reduced demand for private for hire trips, as well as increased demand for urban delivery. Private for hire trips in Portland declined by more than 80% in 2020, so really significant. And I think we're seeing just a very slow rebound, 1 to 3% per month in the recent months, but still down very significantly. And then just looking at some national statistics that we've seen on the e-commerce front, E-commerce grew by 40.5% in the first 9 months of 2020, and online sales at Amazon rose by 24% in the third quarter of 2020. Just sort of some examples of the growth in that sector. Again, we know that one of the reasons that that's growing is because on delivery demand options are really meeting people's needs. They're meeting their economic needs, they're meeting their needs to do things and to get goods in a safe way. So it's not, there's a reason, but it's definitely growing. We've also seen, relatedly, a very significant local job growth in e-commerce despite overall local losses. And then just, this is not, doesn't really have a transportation impact exactly, but we did want to share that there has been one sort of regulation that was passed during this time period associated with the sector. City Council passed a regulation in July 2020 limiting third-party food delivery fees that are charged to restaurants. So they, I think or during the early parts of the pandemic, there had been food delivery charges as much as 30% or so, and now they're limited to either 5% or 10%, depending on if the delivery companies also charge a delivery fee to customers. So that is something that City Council implemented in that realm. And so here, actually, we do have a pretty robust private for hire regulatory program, and I'm actually going to hand it over now to Matt Erickson, who is with us from PBOT's private for hire program, and he's just going to give a pretty quick overview of what we do currently as far as regulating the private for hire industry.
Thanks, Shoshana. As you said, my name is Matt Erickson. I'm the private for hire program manager with the city of Portland. And just to give you guys a quick overview of what it is that we do and kind of how we do it, we regulate anything that is a private for hire vehicle, which we consider anything that puts a passenger in the vehicle. So taxis, your TNCs, which are your Uber and Lyfts, limos and executive sedans, shuttles, tour vehicles, your non-emergency medical transportation, and everything all the way down to the very few pedicabs, quadricycles, and horse-drawn carriages that we have running around the city. The reason we do what we do is, we want to promote, biggest thing is we want to promote safety and consumer protection, making sure all these companies are doing all the things that we have, that the city has mandated that they have to have and that they have to do in order to operate in our city. Those elements as far as vehicle safety inspections, driver background checks, operating requirements as mandated by Chapter 1640 of Portland City Code. We even do driver training and education. All the data collection that you've just seen previously came out of our office, and we run a number of programs across the city. Our primary funding comes from application fees from non-TNC companies, as well as a 50-cent surcharge on TNC rides. Now that 50 cents comes from each individual rider. So it's something you don't even see when you get in a vehicle, but there's a 50-cent city surcharge on every ride that comes out of the city of Portland. And that allows us to fund things like our accessible service fund, which brought about PDX Wave. It's allowed us to implement the transportation wallet, trying to discount rides to lower income communities, and as well as the Safe Ride Home program. Pre-COVID, when people were still going out on New Year's Eve and things, we're trying and make sure that people had a safe ride home. I say a TNC. A TNC is a transportation network company. So that's your Uber, Lyft, Wings, which specifically does rides from the airport. And around the country, there's a number of others, but here in Portland, it's primarily Uber and Lyft. One of the things I was going to say that it's not on these slides, how we do the regulating. We do all of the permitting for all these different groups, background checks. We do inspections in the field, which can lead to the issuing of sanctions. We do compliance inspections and investigations with regards to illegal drivers and illegal companies. Sometimes that involves going to code hearings and other compliance investigations. We conduct all the driver training for the city, as well as we monitor insurance, which is one of the most important things that we do to ensure that these companies are actually maintaining a level of insurance that they've been mandated. So you can go to the next slide. Yeah. And there's another fee out there that the question has come up before is, why we pay so much extra. But the Port of Portland at PDX at the airport, they have the same kind of goals as we do and their own standards, but they tack into an additional fee on top of things. So for every Uber or Lyft trip that comes in or out of the airport, passengers are going to pay $3 for that trip. Any taxis or on-demand shuttles or executive sedan services, there's an additional $3.50, but only for that pickup from the airport as they're moving out to the rest of the city. As far as urban delivery is concerned, when the advent of your Uber Eats and those things came around, we used to get a lot of questions about, complaints from public about why is my food cold, because they didn't have anywhere else to turn. But technically, we don't actually regulate the urban delivery field. That's a yet untapped resource, other than fuel taxes and anything, going again with the restaurants. It's not currently regulated or priced. And then some of the things that we have, some of the groups that we have advising in my world is the Private for Hire Transportation Advisory Committee, which is a group of industry stakeholders and community members who, discuss the issues of the day with regards to the private for hire industry and make recommendations to the director in the city for what can be changed, kind of like what we're doing in this group right here. Just in 2019, the TNC Drivers Advisory Committee was formed, and that's just kind of a sounding board for TNC drivers and their concerns, as we've been talking about just previously before. Some of those concerns with regards to wages, problems dealing with their individual companies, and what we've done is, given them a conduit to speak to the city as well as the city ombuds service to, voice their opinions and voice their concerns and try and find solutions to some of these problems. And then the 2040 Freight Stakeholder Advisory Committee, as well as Portland Freight Committee. I can't personally speak to those, but they're out there with regards to the delivery side of the logistics of this. And that's, I don't know, Shoshana, I don't really have much beyond those two. So
yeah, no, we wanted to sort of make sure that everyone is aware of a number of other committees that are relevant to this topic. So right, Matt interacts with the first two, but there's also several freight committees that we wanted you to know about. So yeah, so thanks. Thank you, Matt. That was the overview of what we do.
no problem.
Yeah.
And Matt, if you could stick around, we've got a few more slides, but then we'll open it up for Q&A. So if folks have questions for Matt, just hold on a few more minutes and then we'll get to those. But I'll kick it back to you, Shoshana.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, we just have we actually, I think we have a good amount of time for discussion tonight. So we'll do just a few more. And again, as Emma said, we'll have some time for Q&A and then some a good discussion, hopefully. So, as you just heard, that's how we currently regulate. And we do have a fee, but it's really just a fee that is to run the program, the administrative and program costs. And essentially, as we've talked about over the last few months, year, I guess, we could think about price signals that are more about sending, managing demand or capturing impacts or prioritizing certain types of trips. I think that's, so if we were to do so, and really, again, the discussion, sort of the level of discussion here, I think is more, does this seem like a good idea? Not getting really deep on the specifics, because there would be a lot to consider. But if we were to do so, to sort of move in the direction of setting more of a demand-based or impact-based fee, there could be just a flat fee that, maybe there's a recommendation that all of these are having a tremendous impact and we should just add a significant new fee on top. Or there could be a fee that is based on something like geography, and you're focusing more on the places where there are more rides or other alternatives that people could use, something like that. There could be fees based on distance. It's interesting to think about, would we want to charge more based on going farther, or would we potentially want to charge more based on the short trips if we know that those are the ones with more alternatives? So lots to think about there, but there could be fees that are more sensitive to distance. There could be fees that are sensitive to time of day, concentrating on peak hours versus not peak hour, things like that. Fees also could be used to incentivize shifting fuel or electric vehicles, things like that. And as well, as we've talked about before, we could use fees to try to send signals around occupancy. There are probably other things, but these are some of the most obvious ones, and I think we've talked about them as they relate to several of the other types of pricing policies. And then, of course, with any of this, there are many implementation considerations if we were to move forward. And I also, I'm going to turn over to Emma in a minute. We're going to talk about just a few examples that we're seeing from other places. It's pretty important to know that especially in the area of urban delivery, as Matt said, we're not really doing anything right now, and we are not alone. There are some examples Emma will share of people who are thinking about things, but there really are not examples of, at least that we could find. If anyone here knows about them, let us know. And there may be. This is a quickly evolving sort of new field with a lot of impacts on the transportation system, but we are not seeing a lot of cities implementing pricing on them right now. And I think folks we know a lot of them who are like, wow, how do we really manage this impact? But they haven't gotten much beyond that. And one thing in particular is that there's a potential conflict with federal interstate commerce regulations. And so we, and I think other cities, are really trying to dig in and figure out exactly where that might still give us room to do things and where it may not. But that one in particular is important to urban delivery. Then there's other things, the availability of data. We also don't know a ton about exactly who's on our streets. Again, especially with urban delivery, we do have some data related to the private for hire and transportation network company industry. We'd have to think about exactly how to use technology to implement things. Also, really similarly to other conversations we've had, how would pricing actually impact demand? What is the elasticity of demand? Would we be able to influence behavior? And then also thinking, I know we've heard a lot from you all about the importance of discounts or exemptions for certain users, and what would that look like in this type of a scenario? Could you do something if somebody's ordering a good, could there be some sort of an exemption for them or not? It feels a little bit more complicated there, but just things to think about. So those are some of the immediate implementation and feasibility considerations. But with that, I think I'm going to hand it back to Emma, who is going to talk a little bit about some examples that we're seeing.
Thanks, Shoshana. And I'll do this pretty quick. These are highlighted in your background memo too, but just to kind of illustrate what this could look like, we wanted to cover a few examples. Starting with the private for hire side, Chicago has a ground transportation tax that was first implemented in 2018, but really updated in 2020 to be more variable and responsive to some climate and equity outcomes. And it's basically a fee on TNCs that charges different amounts based on a whole lot of things, based on how many people are in the car, based on the time of day of the trip, based on where that trip is starting and ending or passing through, and wheelchair accessibility. Taxis and pedicabs also pay the tax, but they pay it on a daily or a monthly rate. It's really not about that kind of demand or impact management. Giving a few examples, I mean, there's a kind of complex chart to figure out exactly what you're going to pay, but if I'm a solo passenger and I'm going within downtown, the most congested zones during the weekday, I could pay up to $8 as a fee for my trip. Versus if I'm taking a shared ride on a weekend, I might only pay 65 cents if I'm not going downtown. And then folks who are taking TNC rides in wheelchair accessible vehicles pay the lowest fee of 55 cents. So it's kind of just giving you an example of how you could really make this a variable and an outcomes based fee. Chicago also has a revenue sharing agreement with its transit authority to give the first $16 million of annual revenue from this tax to fund transit, and the rest stays with the city. I did read that because of budget cuts from COVID, there's some negotiation happening around that right now, but that's the Chicago example. Our friends in New York also have an interesting private for hire demand and impact fee, where they have a congestion zone. It's a pretty large area, South Manhattan, south of 96th Street. And so the way they've set up their pricing system is that you pay more if you're riding alone. So if you're taking a non-shared taxi trip, you're paying a $250 fee to enter that zone. If you're taking a something other than a taxi like an Uber or a Lyft, you're paying a little bit more, $270. But if you take a multi-passenger ride, if you and your buddy want to carpool, that fee comes down to 75 cents. And then paratransit rides pay nothing. An interesting piece of this, and I believe with the Chicago one too, is that the fee has to be passed on to the passenger and it cannot be taken from the driver's pay. So it really is about sending a price signal to the person requesting the service, not a fee intended to be paid by the company or by the driver. And then on the urban delivery side, as Shoshana said, I mean, this is a nascent field. We know a lot of cities are, they're seeing the same numbers that we are about the astronomical growth in e-commerce and on-demand delivery and thinking that's having an impact on our system, but they're also wrestling with some of the same feasibility challenges that Shoshana talked about. So while we are not aware of anyone that has adopted a urban delivery fee, Chicago and New York, they're kind of our buds for this session, both have some proposals out there. Chicago's was proposed at the end of last year by an alderman or a city council person, and it would charge a $125 fee for small packages, a $2.50 fee for heavier deliveries. It would exempt food and medicine. But as you can see, the headline there was $125 onto Amazon orders in Chicago. That one, I believe, has been referred to a committee, so no decision has been made yet. A similar type of charge proposed by a state assemblyman in New York would have tacked a flat fee of $3 onto every package delivered in the New York City boroughs, again, exempting food and medicine. That one came about, that proposal first surfaced around when they were approving congestion pricing, or their cordon pricing system in New York, and was similar to that, kind of tied as a proposal to fund transit. That one I think did not make it kind of out of committee during the year it was proposed, but the recent headlines I've seen are that the lawmakers are planning to reintroduce them in 2021 because of, again, of the continuing growth in the delivery sector. And then finally, I just want to touch on some of the parallel strategies. One thing that's been a theme throughout our whole process is pricing doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's a lot of other stuff going on as well that helps us move forward our climate and our equity goals. And the companies, a lot of the ones we're talking about tonight, do have some pledges of their own to do some fuel transition or fleet conversion. We've put the specific language there from Uber, Lyft, and Amazon just for you to kind of see how they're talking about their goals. And we just wanted to bring this up because, pricing could be an interesting lever cities could use to help kind of encourage that transition to happen or potentially happen quicker, because it might help send a price signal to either the consumer and or the company to do that even faster. But, pricing is also only one of the tools we can use to advance electrification alongside a bunch of other stuff like land use code, infrastructure, and other policy levers that make fuel shifting easier. But one thing you can talk about in your groups is this dynamic between pricing and between electrification. And last but not least, this is a really text-heavy slide. I just want to note that we sent out earlier today the note-taking template that you're going to work through in your small groups. And so you're going to have a chance then to really read this, digest it. But, we've been here 5 times before. What we're going to ask you to do tonight is consider these new prices on private for hire and urban delivery vehicles, specifically demand and impact prices, and ask yourself, what could that do for equitable mobility and for the things we care about in our framework? What we've tried to do in our kind of pre-screen as staff is pull through some of the things we've talked about to date that pricing writ large can do, but then also think about, if we priced this specific sector of VMT on our roads, what unique outcomes could we be seeing, or what unique risks might it portray? So you'll have more time to dive into this, but we wanted to flag that for you. So before I break you off into groups and we have some discussion, I'm going to pause here and see if there are any kind of factual questions we want to answer. I'd ask that you kind of hold your comments and your discussion points for small groups, but definitely want to make sure you have a chance to get your questions answered by our experts. And I will read out Stephanie's first and then go to the hands. Stephanie in the chat says, it's a question for Matt. Do the committees listed complain about congestion and lack of curb space for picking up and dropping off? Matt, you want to take that one?
Short answer, no. No, the questions that come up in there are not really, I would say they don't drill down that far. They're higher level, more industry-wide type questions. And to my knowledge, for as long as I've been with the city, the congestion piece and pickup, other than pickup drop-offs locations and changing loading zones to pick up drop-off locations, it hasn't been a question that's come up.
Got it. Super helpful, Matt. And I also see Stephanie's comment about any possibilities for non-vehicle delivery, vacuum tubes, drones. I think that's a really interesting topic. I'd love for you guys to dive into more in your groups, because yeah, there's the new and ever-changing frontier of urban delivery, and we should think about how a potential price that's trying to regulate demand or impacts could influence that. I'm going to go to hands now. I see Sharifa and then Aaron.
So I just was wondering if there was any, what kind of restrictions are on these fees? Like are there constitutional restrictions on what we can use these fees for the commercial services?
Shoshana, you want to take that one?
Sure, I will jump in that we do not think so. Some of this is interpretation, but I think that these would not be subject to the same restrictions.
Okay, thank you.
As Shoshana mentioned, on the urban delivery side, there are some other kind of legal questions about interstate commerce law and those kind of regulations, but yeah.
And especially with urban delivery, I mean, it sort of depends. It would depend if you're calling something a tax or a fee. I mean, there are all sorts of things to consider, but I don't know that they're necessarily subject to the same constitutional restrictions. So,
Aaron, go for it.
Thanks, and thanks, Matt. A couple of just quick questions. I guess one is like I'm surprised we don't have more Portland specific data, given that these guys, these companies, Uber, Lyft, et cetera, they have to be recording all of the different data. Like, is that just something that we have asked for and they refuse to share with us? Or is that something that we can get so that we're really making educated decisions based upon our city specifically?
It would depend on what kind of data you're looking for specifically, because I mean, we do have, we've got all kinds of data. They give us all of the trip reports. Some of the things we can't share due to non-disclosure agreements, but we do have really as much data as we could possibly get at this point from the TNCs. It would really just depend on what kind of data you were looking for as to whether we have it or whether we can or can't share it.
And I think the distinction, Aaron, that this is the tough thing with kind of talking about multiple types of commercial services in one meeting, but it's on the delivery side. We really don't have a lot of good local data. It's interesting because some of the companies are the same players, but yeah, I think Matt's saying that we've got a good amount of data on the private for hire people movement side, but on the delivery side, we don't know a lot.
Yeah, but I mean, but we could get that data as well perhaps if we started to work with them and really wanted to institute some things.
I think that'd be something of high interest to the city. If we did.
Yes, I think we would have to, I don't think we really have a regulatory framework right now to do it. We would have to implement some new regulations that request the data and work with them to get it. But it's such a, yeah, it's a, you know, so many of these companies are so new on our streets that just right now there isn't any, we'd have to set things up similar to what's set up with the private for hire system.
Okay, and then just one other question. How amenable or resistant are these companies to instituting some sort of fee structure, much like Chicago or New York, or like, do you feel like that? Like, I guess historically with Chicago and New York, did they get a lot of resistance? And then for us here, and you're speaking with them, Matt, like, is that something that they're just seeing as an inevitability, or do you see a lot of resistance to any type of proposed fees that a city would want to institute beyond what we're already doing?
It depends on the day and how the conversation goes between everyone. I think generally the argument that usually comes up is they don't want to see the increase in fees on the public because that is where the fee really comes from. It is a pass through. Shoshana, you may be able to chime in on this better than I can when it comes to other places. But you know, as far as other cities with regard to fees and regulation, you know, we are one of a handful of cities that even have any regulation abilities at all. You know, it's really just New York, Chicago, Portland, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and one or two others who even have the ability to do anything at all. So I think there's a lot of, you know, don't rock the boat that goes on because we don't want to, you know, you don't want to poke the bear and then lose the ability to do what we're able to do now. Yeah, I don't know, Shoshana, you, like I said, you may be able to
No, I think that's accurate, and what Matt is sort of referring to. So there have been attempts so far, not this legislative session, but in the past few legislative sessions, there have been attempts by the TNCs to actually preempt the city, even from the level of regulation that we're doing right now. And many states have that preemption. So we are, you know, we do have some fees, we do have some regulation. I think it's safe to say they would prefer that we didn't, and probably that they would prefer that we didn't add more fees. And I would imagine that on the urban delivery side, it's similar. I think that they are, you know, there is a big impact on the transportation system. They are also serving a need. And I again, seeing what we've seen, at least on the private for hire side, and their attempts to make sure that we don't do more, it probably is safe to say that they wouldn't, the companies wouldn't like to be regulated or have fees.
Sure.
And I think there's also something that for you all to consider when you're discussing is, you know, does it make sense to target these? Or does it make sense to do something that, you know, they are part of it, but there's plenty of people driving around themselves too. Like, you know, what is the most effective thing? And I think that we have heard, I think it was Uber sort of worked a little bit with Seattle a couple of years ago on a proposal more for a cordon in Seattle, because they, you know, their argument was we could get behind this. We think everyone should have to pay if we're going to try to work to manage congestion downtown, but we don't think we should be singled out. So I think that's what they would prefer.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. And I think that's a really great segue. I'm keeping an eye on the clock and I want to get us into groups so we can start discussion. I'm going to use that to move us forward. And really, that's what we're here to talk about tonight. I think, you know, Shoshana laid out, this is a growing share of VMT on our roads. It's also meeting a lot of needs. It's also having a lot of impacts. And right now, we don't have fees in place that kind of work to try to regulate that demand or counter that impacts. Our fees are more kind of about funding the administration and the regulation that we do for private for hire. And on the delivery side, we don't really have anything. So the question for you all to grapple with for the next hour is, are new demand or impact-based fees on these services worth a closer look for advancing equitable mobility? We're not going to get into defining what it would look like exactly, but just, is it worth a closer look? And if yes, what potential outcomes or impacts are most important to consider? So we're going to break into groups and explore that. I'm not going to really go into this. This was just a recap of everything we just talked about, why this is such an interesting and complex area. But when we get into our groups, the first thing you're going to do is look at that table that we sent out in advance and that I kind of flashed up on the screen, and just see, when staff sort of were thinking through this, did we get it right? Is there anything missing, in terms of looking at this through the lens of our equitable mobility framework? And then you'll spend the bulk of your time talking about that question. Is it worth looking at this closer, or should we just look at all trips and kind of consider the strategies we've already talked about? If time allows, you can kind of start thinking about those sort of design parameters that Shoshana talked about. Again, there'd be a lot more work that would need to happen to get to that level, but we're interested to see if you've got any thoughts or druthers there. And then when we come back, I'm just going to ask you guys we'd love to get that kind of temperature of the task force. We're not going to take a poll tonight, but we'd really like to hear, is this an area that really has some promise and you want to dive deeper into? Or, we really think that actually this isn't the place we should focus. So keep an eye to that as we break into groups. If there are no questions or concerns, I'm going to wait just a minute to see if any hands pop up. I'm going to put us into groups. Facilitators, you know how to reach me. I'll pop around and hope you all have a great discussion. All righty. Mariana, are you not seeing your room? Nope, there she goes. And then I've got Ronnie and Ray. Ray, I'll assign you to a room. And Ronnie, if you can hear me, hang out here as long as you want. If you want me to put you in a room, I can, but I'm going to go kind of bounce around and make sure everyone has what they need. Ronnie and Doug, not sure if either of you are there. It's totally fine if you're not, but if you want to be put into a breakout room to listen in, let me know and I'm happy to do that. Hi, folks. Welcome back. Let's give it a few more seconds to let everyone join us. I have to say, Marty and Michael, you guys win gold star for facilitation tonight. You were like on the money, like on the minute. It was great.
It just worked out well tonight.
You had star students, star, breakout group participants. Welcome back, everyone. It's as always, I have the best job of getting to bounce around all of your groups and hear the really fascinating discussion. We're going to jump into a report out in just a second, but first I just want to really apologize to Vivian and to Mel and to your groups for the screen share issues. We have troubleshooted it and figured out what the issue is, but unfortunately to resolve it, I would have had to kick you out of the meeting and bring you back in, and that wouldn't have been fun for anyone. But so thanks all for your patience. We're 12 meetings in and there's still technical difficulties every time. But thank you so much. I'm gonna have us do a little bit of a round robin for takeaways. Try to keep it to a couple minutes per group, just so that we can hear kind of where your temperature is at and how you're feeling about that question about whether these are worth a closer look. So I might pick on Eric's group to go first, if that's okay. And Eric, you are on mute.
Just realizing that. Yep, thank you. It's off now, great. Yes, I'll try to jump in there and invite the group to add or amend as appropriate. I think overall we had a good, rich conversation around both the passenger services and the delivery services. And I think while we identified, I think, a number of key areas of consideration, which I'll review, and also noted, as I think the background presentation did, there are some benefits and upsides of what these services can offer. Really understanding how much those are being delivered is important, particularly around accessibility for individuals with use of mobility devices, for example, and some discussion of data that maybe shows nationally there isn't quite as much benefit as might have been claimed there, but how do we understand how investments in that might, for example, benefit it? Even as I think there is some concern about the inefficiency of the trips, noting the 40% of the time they're driving, the private for hire are driving around empty. What does that mean for our system? Some of those questions. So overall, when we took the sort of vote call, we were thumbs up all the way around for digging in deeper to it. And I think some of the areas that were most recurrent in our themes were understanding time and place. A lot of suggestion around the downtown at 5 p.m. probably differentially costed than something at different times where the contribution to congestion and system impact is likely different. Also consideration around how incentivization of fuel shifting could occur through pricing, recognizing that these fleets are often people's first exposure to electric vehicles and have some benefit there, but how we think about signals that might either make it more cost effective for people to drive those and or pick them up, including concepts around fee baits where you might collect everything and then redistribute it to folks on that basis was another area of interest. Also discussion around distance. And recognizing that, especially from an equitable mobility perspective, the shorter trips might actually be more of a concern since there are other options that might meet that, and that we're more likely to be addressing longer trips where gentrification and displacement has been an issue, and we want to not necessarily burden folks needing to make those longer trips in these vehicles, which might be an appropriate consideration there, or an appropriate choice there. And then I'm trying to think if there were any other key considerations that were lifted up. I think I will note there was certainly discussion around the workforce opportunity benefits and making sure that we're cognizant of that and not overly burdening drivers in that construct. And there was a little bit of discussion linking some work actually in Seattle that I shared between thinking about what the basically the effective earning potential of operators or drivers is by way of kind of generating a minimum wage and keeping an eye on basically how much time they're spending not earning money versus earning money when they're on the platforms. There's an interesting potential connection between the efficiency of minimizing that out of that zero passenger travel with actually ensuring workforce opportunity as well. So that's something to think about and maybe dig into more from our neighbor to the north.
Great.
Anything else, team, from from our conversation that I missed?
Maybe just to flag the accessibility point that was made around how the fees could be reinvested for more wheelchair accessible rides. I think that one came up early on.
Thanks,
That's
Melina. Anything else from the task force members?
See Stephanie's hand up.
Please.
So don't forget the drones and the non-vehicle way
Yeah,
of
thank you.
thinking.
Yeah. Awesome. Man, you guys covered ground. That's great. Well, thank you very much, Eric. Can I go to Ingrid's group next?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So our group, we talked about a lot. One of the biggest takeaways, oh, I'm sorry, of course the dog starts barking. One of the biggest takeaways is pricing transparency. So during that time when restaurants were able, hold on a sec, I'm gonna grab my dog. During that time when restaurants were able to add 40% to the price of takeout and food, there's just so much it wasn't transparent to the customer. And there's a lot of discussion in our group about, you know, if that pricing were more transparent, that people would potentially make better decisions about when to order. Like if we're pricing more for peak times, then people can, and people know that we're pricing more for peak times, they can make decisions kind of to help us achieve those outcomes. Just kind of the peak period is a huge burden, and it's growing, and it's impacting this, like it's going to continue to impact us, right? The peak traffic periods. And so really my group thought that was an area that we really should focus. It has huge financial impacts and other impacts. Making sure that we're not burdening the little guy. So like figuring out pricing systems in which mom and pop restaurants are not burdened, and potentially do a legislative fix where, you know, you aren't allowed to pass it along to restaurants. Not sure if that's a city council decision or a state legislative decision. It sounded like it could be a Portland specific legislative piece to basically say this, you know, we're pricing, but it can't get taken from driver salary. So there's a lot of kind of interest in trying to figure out how we do that and don't burden the people who should not be burdened, and that the cost should be borne by the bigger players that could actually take those burdens. Deadheading came up in our group too. The 40% is an unnecessary waste, especially during the peak periods. And one of the ideas from our group was basically to have the city figure out a potential holding place, like a centralized holding place for TNCs that allows them to be able to have quick access to customers, or have customers come to that holding place to reduce deadheading, and potentially, you know, have charging stations there or Wi-Fi for those drivers at that place. Generally, our group really liked this topic area, and actually wish that we had spent more time talking about this specific area versus some of the other areas that we've talked about, mostly because there's so many, you know, interested stakeholders, there's economic impact, there's more local control over some of the levers in this area. So they really felt like it was a low-hanging fruit. My group, anything else that I missed that you'd like to share or elaborate on?
Thanks so much, Ingrid. Really appreciate that. I'll go to Shoshana next.
And I'm reporting out for the group.
Great.
I'm going to attempt to highlight the things that I found really interesting here. I'm not going to try to comprehensively cover the really rich conversation that we had. It is in the notes, though. My team's very trustworthy of me, my note-taking abilities. Overall, the group was really interested in taking a closer look at both private for hire trips and urban delivery trips, especially in conjunction with other tools being utilized. Again, we've looked at this mosaic a lot overall in this task force, and it continues to come up in small group discussions as well. I think a big interest that we talked about was the unrestricted nature of the revenue as being an important aspect of the strategy for both private for hire trips as well as urban delivery trips. So those Chicago examples were really interesting to us in thinking about what those cost share agreements could be for other modes. We did talk about, we actually closed out our conversation talking a lot about urban delivery trips and thinking about how to make them equitable if the price was raised, thinking about how to do low income discounts, and really considering the impacts on folks with disabilities and how we could run it through existing programs like SNAP or Oregon Trail, and what the impact would be more broadly, and where does the subsidy need to come from and who would be responsible for that, such as the city. We ended our conversation on something which made me really excited, which was an emphasis on, what this is like, the impact would be on the workers, especially for delivery drivers. What is the price point? In which, for example, a customer could reduce their tip because the fees are already so high and they're trying to actually just level up the price point for themselves in their own self-interest. So this could further systemic inequity based on the workforce of these gig economy jobs, more likely to be lower income, more likely to be people of color. And so with the labor practices of these companies, they're already an existing externality that other transportation modes don't exactly replicate in the same way. And so that was a really thoughtful discussion that we ended our time with based on that. But overall, I think we agreed that we share a cynicism in companies to absorb the cost themselves. They would just pass it right on to the consumer. So that was our overarching sort of framework in which we discussed private for hire trips and urban delivery.
Great wrap up. Thanks so much, Vivian. And last but certainly not least, Marty's group.
Sure. So I think in general, the consensus in our group was that, yes, we should definitely, the city should take a closer look at both fees for private for hire or for urban delivery. So that was the general consensus. I think on kind of towards the end of our conversation, although it was themed throughout, just this acknowledgement that we really want to be careful to not trap, the public into a fee when there are no other options for them. So, not forcing folks into kind of more expensive or, just, other things that kind of make like life difficult. So we did spend quite a bit of time talking about geographic differences. So for example, if someone has if there's a higher fee for Lyft and Uber downtown, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because then folks can be making other decisions in kind of a transit rich area similar to the airport as well. But if we had that same sort of fee structure in a place that wasn't as transit rich, that would be an unnecessary burden onto the public. Another point I thought was pretty interesting was just specific to the private for hire, thinking about demand or impact-based fees there, is that as Matt had already presented earlier this evening, that the city of Portland currently has a 50-cent fee. And so there already is a regulatory framework laid out. And so that's something that could be built on to specifically talk about demand and congestion. So that was a point as well. And then kind of there were questions, and I think this came up in other groups as well, but questions on both the private for hire trip fees related to that, as well as urban delivery, is just having this transparency of what those fees would collected would, where they would actually go. And also if those fees are collected, do they truly have a connection to reducing congestion? Is there a tie there? So I think there was a lot more to highlight, but those are the things that come to mind that I'd like to share tonight. So
thank you so much, Marty. And yeah, clearly this is a hot topic and so much to discuss. So much so that I'm going to give Eric 10 more seconds to make one more point.
Great. Thanks, Emma. Just wanted to, especially as we got more into these considerations and how we might design things, note that while I think Matt is accurate earlier when he shared that we get a lot of information and some of the richest information of any city in the country, I would say that I don't think we have complete information for some of the management tools that we're discussing here today. For example, we're only collecting information on trips that start in Portland, not that end in Portland. And certainly that's not all the trips that occur in Portland for one. Also, not as much information associating trips with vehicle types and some of those other issues that you might want to link as we design some of these things. So I think we have a strong foundation to build on, but just wanted to note that I think that there might be some additional data requirements that we would want to do to help implement and manage these programs.
Thanks, Eric. Really important point. Well, folks, we're at time, so I'm not going to do the kind of look ahead to next steps, but I do want to ask you, we're going to give you the chance to do your normal meeting evaluation, but we have 2 super quick poll questions, and they're related to how we make best use of your time as we look to our next phase of work. So as I mentioned, we've finished kind of all of our introduction meetings, the first chance to wrestle with this stuff, and we're entering our next phase, which is going to be looking at some technical analysis and kind of going deeper and moving towards recommendations. And as we do that, we want to make sure that how we're sharing information is working for you. So I'm going to launch this Zoom poll. You should be able to see it. The question is, have you been able to review the pre-meeting materials that we've been sending out, which is like the memos, the pre-recorded presentations? Have you been able to see those? So I'll give you just 30 seconds to do a quick response. And there's no right or wrong answer. No one's going to get in trouble. It's all anonymous. This will help us plan and help you. Seeing the results come in. I'll give it just a couple more seconds. Okay, so what I'm seeing, I won't share this with everyone, but what I'm seeing is that about a quarter are yes, I'm reviewing them all, about 40% mostly, and about 40% a bit. So that's super helpful for us. So then we've got one more question for you. This one is, as we try to balance pre-meeting information with in-meeting discussion, which is always kind of our tension, what balance would work best for you? So more background before the meetings, so we have more time to discuss, a mix kind of like we're doing now, or less background before and more time to learn and do presentation in the meetings. And thanks for staying a couple minutes past 8. I know we're all hungry and tired. Like just a couple more folks to respond. Okay, so what I'm seeing here is most people, about 70%, like the mix we've got now. Some background, but a little recap in the meeting and then discussion. And then kind of equal numbers are feeling more background pre or less background pre. So I think we'll try to stick with this balance that we have now, and continue to kind of provide what we can ahead of time so you can come in kind of informed and ready to discuss. As always, I am going to put the link to our, Mariana already did it. Thank you, Mariana, to our evaluation survey. We read every single one of those, and they're super helpful as we prepare. We're moving a little bit more into a workshop format for our next few meetings. And so this is all super, super helpful. I know it was a lot to chew on tonight. We're going to come back to this topic. We're going to read everything that your note takers captured. And I really, really appreciate you being with us. Shoshana, any closing comments before we end?
No, just thanks everyone. So great to hear from you as usual.
Stay safe, stay healthy, and see you in March, my friends.
Thanks, everyone. Good night. Bye-bye.
Good night.